Welcome to Scene Change, a podcast by the National Federation of the Blind Performing Arts Division. All about equality, opportunity, accessibility, and the arts. Here, you'll learn adaptive techniques from performers in the know. We are changing what it means to be blind, one stage at a time. Thank you for joining us today. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Scene Change. I'm your host, Lizzy Muhammad Park, and today's episode will be absolutely legendary. You know him, you love him, and even if I didn't say his name, you'd recognize his voice immediately. Wonder why? It's Jonathan Mosen. Welcome
My
to the
goodness, no pressure at all. No pressure. It's really nice to be here, Lizzie.
We're so glad to have you on. And I've got to tell you, you are, and no one else get mad at me for this, but you are the most humble guest we've ever had on the show. And it's crazy, like you don't have to be. And I'm just like, what? Of course we want to have you on the show. We've been like, this has been in the works. So I've just been like, oh my goodness, how do I interview a podcaster for a podcast? Oh, so there's a lot of pressure
Well,
on me today.
I was really surprised to get the invitation because I listen to Scene Change. I think it's a great podcast and it's so cool to hear people being creative in so many different ways. So when I got the email, I thought, wow, squee. I mean, I get this is great.
Oh my goodness. So we're gonna have so much fun today. Let me just do this is not even half of an intro, but I had to narrow it down. You know what I mean? Your resume is quite long, but for those, for our listeners who don't know, you've received the Balatin Award for your podcast, Living Blindly. And we'd be remiss if we didn't plug your other podcast, the Blind Podmaker Feed, uh, which is it's not similar to what we're doing today. We're kind of getting more into like the background of what you're doing, but that's an excellent resource for anybody who's thinking of getting into podcasting. And then of course, I mean, come on, you run the Federation's technology podcast, Access On. So I know everyone knows you're from there.
Sure, it's a great gig to be able to do access on and spread the Federation's message in the context of all the technological change that's going on. I mean, there's never been a more exciting time to be involved in tech.
I agree 100%. So we're going to get into all that and more on this podcast, at least today's episode, this podcast about podcasting. So we'll just
Mm.
jump right in. You know how I always start these interviews. In case, for anyone who's new, either to the podcast or to meeting you for the first time, what's your blindness journey? I know, well, but now you can tell everyone where you're from. For those who think you're from Australia, it's
Oh,
not.
God, no, please. I was born in New Zealand and I am totally blind and have been since birth. I have a condition called Norrie's disease, which when I was a kid, I was told was really rare and there was supposedly only one family in the world that also had this. But since I've been involved with the Federation, I've met a lot of people who also have it. And so that comes with blindness. And then as a bonus, you get a degenerative hearing impairment absolutely free. So my hearing has deteriorated over time. And obviously, as somebody who loves to work with audio and also has spent a fair amount of time in noisy exhibit halls and things like that, that's a bit of a challenge, because for a long time, I've always been pretty comfortable in my own skin about my blindness, but for a long time, I kind of didn't want to talk about the hearing impairment. So people would meet me and they'd go away and they'd say, oh man, he's just so aloof or he's so rude. I said hello to him and he didn't even say hello back. So now I'm a lot more transparent about the hearing thing, and I have to be because it does degenerate over time.
That's true, and that's something that we're big on in the Federation is, just own it. You know what I mean? When you own
Yeah.
it, you get to decide a lot more. So I think that is so cool that you are owning that bonus of yours.
Yeah.
Now, you started podcasting over 20 years ago. And of course, there's this question of, well, how'd you get started with podcasting? Because I mean, really back then it was more internet radio, wasn't it?
Yeah, my involvement in, shall we say, international broadcasting for the blind
Mm-hmm.
community goes back to the 1990s when technology called Shoutcast came along. And I was playing with this just because I like to play with the toys. And I remember it was New Year's Eve, 1998, going into 99. And I suddenly thought, if traditional terrestrial radio can bring people together in their local community, we too, as blind people, have a community. We've got common challenges and opportunities and tools and tips and techniques. What if we could have a radio station that brought blind people together and also had blind people broadcasting to other blind people and the world as well? So that's how I started to get into the concept of finding a way for blind people to collaborate, get together, and do internet radio. And, I did that. I was able to do that professionally for some years. But podcasting came along in 2004. And the big advantage of that is, of course, people can listen on their own schedule. So you can produce a program, you can upload it, people can listen to it wherever they are. So I was one of the very early adopters of podcasting. I think I published my first podcast in about October of 2004.
Whoa, that is so cool. And what was that podcast called?
It was actually a podcast of the Mosen Explosion radio show, which I still host. So I started that, I don't know, man, 27 years ago or something ridiculous. And then I did put it out as a podcast with the music edited out and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it was really popular because I used to do this, I think it was on a Saturday afternoon at that stage, my time in New Zealand, because I was working full time for Humanware by this time that I did the podcast. And people would call in from around the world and just hang out and get together. But a podcast opened it up to a whole new audience.
That is so cool. And because you're so good with technology, I mean, you really do seem like a one-man operation. So, how did you start that first show? What was that? Did you have a team? Did you have the technology experience already from Humanware and so on and so forth, and just kind of do it yourself? What was that experience like?
Well, I worked with a lot of amazing, talented people who I still keep in touch with in the early days of internet radio. Ultimately, it was actually ACB that hired me to produce ACB Radio, and I founded
Oh.
that. And we really built that thing up. And it wasn't just me, it was an incredible team effort of amazing volunteers from around the world. And when I left, we had people in, I think, 9 countries broadcasting, and we had listeners in 70 countries. So it was just incredible working with so many people. And I think it was a bit more challenging then because ways of collaborating online were not as well established, if I might use some terribly egregious passive voice in that sentence. But, but it was harder, because when you get involved in radio things, you inevitably get involved in ego
Right.
things. Because I think people do. When you're performing, any kind of performance, there's an element of ego there, I
Mm-hmm.
think. So it was difficult to deal with some of those things when you're dealing with conflict online and the tools just weren't as well established. So that was a bit of fun. But we did a lot of good. Main Menu, of course, was the first global grassroots technology show for blind people by blind people talking about technology. So I had all of that. But when I started podcasting, it was just me doing that. And in those days, I had to. So the old Monty Python sketch about 4 Yorkshiremen, we had it tough. But in those days, I had to handcraft the RSS feed. I would write the RSS feed by hand. Every time we added an episode, I'd open up Notepad and write all the code in manually and upload it. It's much easier now. But yeah, it was just me doing that first podcast.
How about for Access On? I believe you will have a podcast studio at the National Center. Is that correct, or are you still running that one on your own?
We do have a recording studio at the Jernigan Institute, which is really cool. And I also have a mini studio in my office, which is actually quite a large office. In fact, when I moved here and they showed me where my office was, I called all my kids on FaceTime and I panned the camera around and I'm like, whoa, look at this office. Well, so it's great. And I have in my office a Vocaster 2 with a Heil PR40. And the thing about that microphone is that it's really directional. You have to be right in front of it for it to pick you up. So it's great. It doesn't pick up any room ambience and it's perfect for this. So when I'm doing Access on, because I have to fit it in around the many other wonderful things I get to do for the Federation. So an Access On episode that sounds like it's flowing may actually have been put together over several sessions just when I get a moment to add to it during the week. So having it right there in my office really helps. So I have the Vocaster 2 connected to my laptop, the Heil PR40 and Reaper, and that's really all you need. And I think that this is one of the very cool things. The barriers to entry and the tools now that are available for podcasting means that more people can publish good quality podcasting. And as my youngest son would say, I'm totally down with that. I think it's really democratizing.
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree with that. Um, Before we get into our next question, we are going to pause for a brief message from our national office about the Give 25 fundraising campaign.
Make a difference with the National Federation of the Blind's Keep NFB Advancing Give $25 campaign. Each year, thousands of Federation members and friends contribute to support blind people, but we still need your help to fund our programs in 2026 and beyond. When you give $25 between May 15th and July 7th, you're entered into the Keep NFB Advancing drawing. Each $25 increment is a chance to win. Your support helps us continue to build a network that advances the lives of all blind people across America. You could win prizes like round-trip transportation for two to the 2027 NFB National Convention, hotel accommodations, registration, banquet tickets, or $2,000 cash. What a chance to win a Braille Note Evolve from Humanware? Become a Federation Connector. Ask friends and family to contribute before National Convention and indicate that you prompted their giving. The Give $25 drive supports the Kenneth Jernigan Fund, Sun Fund, Ten Brook Memorial Fund, and the White Cane Fund. You can choose a fund when you donate. To enter, visit nfb.org/give25donate. That's nfb.org/give25donate. Call 410-659-9314, extension 2430, or send a check to National Federation of the Blind and mention hashtag Give25 and the fund in the memo. The winner will be announced July 8th, 2026. Thank you for your generosity.
Okay, so how has podcasting changed for blind people over the years? You kind of just alluded to it in your previous comment about the barrier to entry. But if there's anything else that you'd like to add.
You really did have to be an audio and a technical geek at the beginning because podcasting's an interesting fusion of technology. I mean, at its heart, it's some sort of file, certainly in the early days, most likely an MP3 file. So you had to be able to learn how to encode that MP3 file, and that was pretty straightforward. But then you had to also work out how to serve that file in a way that was conformant to the podcast standards. And in earlier times, there weren't the tools that we have now, the simple web interfaces to publish a podcast. And of course, you also had to know how to use a sound editor to put it all together. We had pretty good access to single track sound editors in those days. SoundForge was pretty good. Studio Recorder from APH was around, and that was and still is also very good for spoken word. There was Goldwave. It got a little bit more complicated when you wanted to do multi-track audio. There were fewer choices and it got a bit more complicated. Cakewalk was a pretty popular tool back then. And to just illustrate why that's important, I love to tell the story about how I was interviewing someone a few years ago. And before we started the interview, this person said, I got to warn you, I've got a little bit of a cough. I hope that's okay. I didn't want to pull out on you at the last minute. And I said, it'll be fine. We can edit it out. But what happened was every time I asked a question, this guest took the opportunity to have a major coughing fit. Um, and had I not at that time had a multi-track recorder, it would have been a disaster because I would have had to essentially re-record my questions to get rid of all the coughing. But because it was a multi-track recording, I could just delete their cough from that track, leaving my questions intact. So there are so many advantages to using multi-track recording for pretty much anything that you want to do.
I like how you said about the MP3. It was pretty easy to do. It was pretty straightforward, you said, to do. Oh my goodness, for you, you're a tech guy. I don't know if this podcast would exist if today were 2004, 2005. I am so
Yeah.
not techie, and this is why I'm so grateful to, Drew, our current producer, Shane, our former producer. I'm like, oh my, these are the tech guys. You know what I mean? I can come up with questions and have some personality, but my goodness, you really had to know that stuff back then. It was
Yeah, and the
different.
thing is,
Hmm.
it's a shame because these things are a barrier to people who have important things to say. I
Right.
truly love the democratizing nature of podcasting. When you consider before internet streaming and podcasting, the only people who could get their voices heard like this were people who had access to the airwaves, which were limited and incredibly controlled, and there was licensing and all sorts of things. So now our messages can get out there. I think that's particularly important for blind people who are often silenced for various reasons. And then when you look at the hardware that's out there now, I mean, it's not only easy for somebody to produce a podcast, but it's much easier than ever for someone to produce a really good quality podcast. They can be sitting there in a closet or something with a USB microphone and mastered their sound tool, and it still sounds just as professional as somebody with thousands of dollars worth of equipment.
Isn't that so cool? And I know that's something that's important to you. I've heard you say it on, gosh, I don't remember which podcast. I listened to quite a few of them. Um, I don't know which one you said it on, but you said it was important for you to have a meaningful podcast. Essentially one that would make change. Um, and I'm assuming that that's something that you went into with each of your shows is ensuring that it was going to be meaningful for your listeners.
So it's something that I've struggled with, and it's something I think, finally been able to come to terms with, right? So when I got into this, I love the medium. I worked in commercial radio in New Zealand for a while, and there are lots of blindness related struggles around how I got there, and
Right.
it wasn't easy. And I enjoy the craft of radio. When I'm sitting here in front of the mic, I imagine, and I got this advice from one of the best broadcasters I've ever seen in action, and he said, if there's one thing that people can't help overhearing, it's an intimate conversation. And so I try, when I'm doing like a one-off podcast and I'm not talking to someone else, to put myself in a position where I'm trying to talk to my imaginary listener. Hopefully, there's at least one, and I talk to that person and try and have that conversation. What happened though is, I think, through a combination of maybe a bit of skill, but also just being in the right place at the right time and all those sorts of things, I suddenly started to come to terms with the fact that people were really listening to what I was saying. I know that sounds odd, but it's, I guess I've struggled to accept or fully realize the impact of what I say. So I've become a lot more careful about that now. Um, and that's a challenge, and it's also a responsibility. And it's one of the reasons why, when President Riccobono and I were having long, interesting conversations about what would it take for me to come to NFB to take on the technology work here, we talked a lot about living blindly, and he said, "Well, I don't want to be the person that goes down in history as the one who shut living blindly down." And but I eventually said to him, "Mark, the thing is, if I keep doing living blindly, people are understandably going to get confused about when is this Jonathan's opinion and when is it the NFB's. And if you take on a leadership role like the one I am truly honored to have at the NFB, you can't have both." So it was actually me that pulled the plug on living blindly just to avoid that ambiguity. And because I have come to terms a bit with the role I seem to have acquired in the community that I didn't necessarily seek, but I have it regardless.
Wow. And what are some of your highlights? I mean, you've been doing this in, various capacities. What are some of the highlights that you've been able to have over the years?
Whew, that's a trick question, Lizzie. Three immediately come to mind. One is I'm a major sci-fi fan, and there's an author called Robert J. Sawyer, and when he puts out a book, he's one of two or three authors where I just drop everything, and I say to Bonnie, "There's a new Robert J. Sawyer book out now. Buy," and I go away and I don't materialize until I've finished the book. And back in 2009 or thereabouts, he started writing a trilogy that had a blind character as the protagonist. It's really good. And he
Really?
did a lot of careful research, depicted the blind person well. She was a young woman, I think, from memory in high school. She was a JAWS user. He accurately reflected the way that someone would use JAWS, and it was just brilliant. So when I got to interview him, as somebody who's read everything he's written, that was just an absolute thrill. And that was when I was doing Freedom Scientific's podcast. The other one, the second one of three that I remember really vividly is when I was younger, I wanted to eventually end up in politics, and I did actually stand for Parliament in New Zealand, but fortunately the people were too sensible to elect me. But I was always interested in politics. I am a very political animal. I mean, I follow politics from all around the world. And when my former wife and I went to the UK when we were quite young, like 18 or 19, I had found out that there was a blind guy who had been elected to Parliament, a Labour Party MP. So I thought, well, what have I got to lose? So I called his office when we were on vacation in the UK, and I said, I'm blind too. I'm really interested in how he got there, and he very graciously spent an hour with me, and I never forgot his generosity because I was a bit precocious and even more bumptious than I am now and all that sort of stuff because I was like 18 or something. And he was just amazing. And then he moved on to very big things. He actually became the Home Secretary, which was one of the most senior positions in government, in Tony Blair's government at the time of 9/11. He was seen reading Braille in the House of Commons. Every time his guide dog needed to be replaced or did some major oopsie or something, it was like on the news. It was a big deal having a blind person there. And in 2017, I got to interview him again on my Blindside podcast. And it was just, you know, what that taught me was you never forget when someone shows you a kindness. And it's why, if a young person reaches out to me for some reason or wants to chat at convention, I try to pay it forward because that had such a big impression on my life. And interviewing him after he'd been through all of that was amazing for me. It was, the final one, and I'm sure there are many others, but the final one that immediately comes to mind was actually living blindfold's interview with President Riccobono, because that was an extraordinary act of integrity and courage on his part because we had talked about it. I said, I understand why you might not want to do it, but if you do it, I'm not going to give you questions in advance. I never do that. I'm going to ask you what I think people want me to ask you without any kind of holding back. You can choose not to answer the question, of course. He answered every question thoughtfully and graciously. And I just came away, this was long before it was on the cards that I would be here. I just came away with absolutely unbridled respect for his heart, his integrity, and how much he cares. And it was an incredible moment. That was a 2-hour interview that I did with him.
It was a good interview, actually. I heard that one and it got me to thinking, of course, this is I listened to it retroactively. I'd already known the position that, you were already in Baltimore by the time I heard it. But
Mm.
it got me to thinking about how you're so good at connecting with people, not even just in terms of podcasting, but in terms of the work that you do right now, where you're able to, I didn't realize that you were into politics, but it makes sense now because you're into advocacy. You're into spreading the word, positively about blindness, but you have your personal passion of technology and
Mm.
you get to right now, what you seem to be doing, at least from the outside looking in, is blending your personal passion with your, professional experience and expertise, and you have what I would call I think most people would call it a dream job when you get to mix your passion um, with things that you're just naturally good at. So, how did you get to where you are today? As far as your work in the Jernigan Institute, as far as Access On, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, thank you, first of all. I really appreciate the kind comments. I ran the government relations program for New Zealand's blind community for 5 years, a long time ago now. And as part of that, um, we we got to thinking, a bunch of us in New Zealand, about copyright. What an exciting subject copyright is. Although it's a subject very dear to the heart of many creators, I'm sure, especially in
Mm-hmm.
the context of AI.
Mm-hmm.
But what we said was, is there really any difference between access to the printed word and access to the built environment? So in the 1990s, access to the built environment was enshrined in the law, but access to the printed word was not. And so the agency that I worked for at the time would sometimes go to a publisher and they'd say, we want to put your book into talking book or braille. Can we please, please, pretty please do this? And some of the publishers would come back and say, no, no, you can't, get lost. And there was nothing that we could do about that. So we thought that this shouldn't stand, access to information is a human right. And that's why we got the copyright law passed in New Zealand on that basis. But the thing is, no one had done that before. So when I attended my first NFB convention in 1995, as a young guy who, has been deeply, deeply influenced by the NFB since I was a teenager, and the NFB probably saved my life when I was a teenager. I met with Jim Gashel, who, of course, is a legend in governmental affairs for the NFB, and he said, I want to talk to you about how you did that. And then the Chafee Amendment came along later here in the US, and ultimately we got the Marrakesh Treaty. So I learned at a very young age that if you really have a good idea and you have the ability to bring people with you and persuade people and be patient, there's no end to what you can achieve. And I've taken that view into various things. Immediately before I came to the Federation to work and live, I was chief executive of New Zealand's largest employment agency for disabled people for 5 years. And so I had to work with a lot of employers in that role who perceived people with all sorts of disabilities as a health and safety risk, a productivity drain, all these negative things. And rather than get upset with them, I sat around their board tables and took them to lunch and talked to them and said, let's have an environment where you can say, without any kind of fear of retribution, what your fears are. What's really bothering you about hiring the people that I represent? And let's talk about the reality. And we were getting them to yes. So you've got to meet people where you are. And I think that's probably all these things help to get me here, I think, because I'm one of those people who can geek out and talk with the technical folks at some of these big tech and smaller tech companies. But I also have been schooled from afar in the philosophy of the Federation.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's sometimes hard to find articulate geeks who and political geeks. Every so often I hear, usually just kind of secondhand from people who say, "Why the heck do we need to bring in somebody from another country to do this?" And I understand that, but I think what I'm trying to do is help all blind Americans, because so much goes on here that influences the whole world, given that all of the big tech companies are based here. And if we can just work together to get these folks to yes and to keep an eye on them, then we'll all benefit. That translates into more opportunity, and more opportunity for blind people is what we're about.
For sure. I mean, it's really not a question of bringing someone from quote unquote another country or another place. It's really because it's a global issue, honestly. So, that's it's interesting when people kind of have these different ideas about and I mean, partially okay, fine, US law, blah blah blah, but if someone from another country has a good idea, I don't really care what country they're from. So speaking of tech, speaking of copywriting, et cetera, where do you see podcasting going in the future? Particularly with AI, because I know that's something that's on everyone's mind.
Well, AI is one of those forces that has made a difference to blind people's lives in both directions. One of the things we're thinking about a lot right now is these AI based recruiting tools. We are not sure how those algorithms work and whether secretly what's happening is that if it's clear from your resume that you're a blind person or you have some other disability, you are going to be put into the no pile. And there are also some interviewing processes which discriminate because they score you down if you don't make eye contact, and there are testing regimes and things. So then when it comes to any kind of content, obviously the world is being flooded with AI generated podcasts and music. It's a pandemic, and I run an email list so that we can all share notes and tips and tricks as blind podcasters. And sometimes people pop up on that email list and they say, "Oh, I don't need to talk on a podcast anymore because I've got one of these tools that has two AI sounding co-hosts, and I can just generate that, and it's going to be epic." And it really is not. I mean, people can tell. Notebook LM, for example, is a case in point. This is a Google technology. It's kind of a fun study aid, but once you've listened to two or three things generated by Notebook LM or some other AI tool, it becomes formulaic. I mean, I can tell. I recently uh, interviewed for a couple of roles here at the Federation, and we had a lot of job applicants, and I could tell when people had just typed a prompt into ChatGPT or something similar and and sent the answer back, to the extent that I even got a couple of applications that ended "yours sincerely, your name here." I'm like, hello. So I think that there is still a place. There always will be a place for real humans with real personality and warmth and ideas and little quirks to continue to produce content of all kinds. I'm hoping it will become even easier to produce. That's always good. But I think we're going through a phase where people are pushing the boundaries a little bit. There will be some pushback. And I still believe that those with talent in the creative space are going to be okay.
So, as our final question here, what kind of advice would you give to someone who's thinking of starting a podcast or, um, just anything in the whatever podcast he becomes in the future that we may not even know about yet?
Sure. Two things I can immediately think of. One is that the medium is secondary. So I see people who say, "Oh, I want to start a podcast," as if it's something that they just want to get off their bucket list. And then they scramble around thinking, what can I start a podcast on? What am I good at? In my experience, those things never work out. Most podcasts don't get beyond double digits in the episodes because somebody gets enthusiastic for a little bit, they try it, and then they can't sustain it. Because podcasting of a quality that people will listen to in such a crowded market is really hard work. So my advice first would be the podcast is the means, it's not the end. The end is I have a message or a talent or a passion I want to share. And if podcasting is the best way to do that, then that's great. Maybe it's a Substack thing or your own blog or something. It might not be a podcast, but start with your what first and then go on to the how, to the methodology. And the second thing I would say is to quote New Zealand's probably most famous former Prime Minister, um, Jacinda Ardern, you do you. Don't try and emulate anybody else. The Be yourself because everybody else is already taken. So bring your own style into the podcast. Be yourself, and if people don't like it, that's fine. Just be honest and true to yourself, but also respect your audience. If there's one thing that gets me personally as a listener, switched off podcasts real quick, it's the disrespect so many podcast hosts show for my time and the time of their listeners. So many podcasts are full of long-winded preamble before they actually get to the point already. There's in-jokes and weird laughter because the podcast hosts get it, but you don't. And suddenly you feel like you're an outsider.
Mm,
You feel like you're not included in some cliquey thing. And when
yeah.
you feel like an outsider, you're gonna move on to the next podcast. So I think you should always consider your listeners, who you're aiming for, have a couple of personas in mind. Talk about what your typical listener is like. Make up a story about their history, what they do every day, what motivates them, what drives them, and be clear who you're talking to.
Mm. That was some really good advice. Really good. And okay, I know I said that the last one's the final question, but this one's an easy one. How can people keep how can people keep up with you and all that you've got going on?
Actually, probably the place I'm most active is on Mastodon. I really like that, and that's a whole different discussion. But we're not being bounced around by the algorithm there, and it really
Hmm.
fits with the Federation's philosophy. So if you're on Mastodon, or even if you're not, you can follow me at Jonathan Mosen at caneandable.social. That's CANE and able.social. And I started that Mastodon instance as a place for blind people to congregate and communicate. So if you've always thought, oh, maybe I should try this Mastodon thing out, you're welcome to go to caneandable.social and get an account there.
Awesome. That was nice. I like that Mastodon plug.
Yeah, there
So
you go.
I know, right? Well, thank you so very much for joining us. It's been fun. I love laughing with you. So we you're welcome back anytime.
Oh, thank you so much for asking me. I really am very honored, and keep up the awesome work with the podcast. This is one I never miss.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our listeners. This has been another episode of Scene Change.
I'm Caitlin McIntyre, President of the National Federation of the Blind Performing Arts Division. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Scene Change. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and visit our website at nfb-pad.org. There you'll find links to our social media, membership, and resources for blind performers.
Thanks to everyone who makes this show happen. Scene Change is executive produced by Shane Lowe, Caitlin McIntyre, and Lizzy Muhammad Park, with audio production by Drew Mochak. Also on the team are Maddie Hendricks, Aaron Jordan, and Melissa Sprouse, with music by Ryan Strunk and Tom Page.
Remember, you can be the performer you want. Blindness is not what holds you back. We'll see you next time.
If someone from another country has a good idea, I don't really care what country they're from. They could, Anyway, I was gonna say they could be from outer space for all I care, but maybe cut that. Maybe cut that. He's totally gonna keep it in there. What was I gonna say?